All right, everyone. So this is part two of Unity Refresher. Last class or last module, we talked about creating scenes. I should say we creating projects, creating scenes, importing 3D models, adding lights, adding cameras. We talked about creating materials in Unity. We also talked about what else did we talk about? We talked about don't oh, we also talked about colliders and physics. Okay. All right. So download the files for today, or you can look at the drills if you'd like to. These drills are called Refresher Part 2. I have already added them into my Unity hub and loaded them. This is exercise one. Okay. This is my scene. I have a red ball, okay, and I have a yellow cube, okay. Now, if I put this in play mode, not much is going to happen. The reason why, there we go. Not much is going to happen. And the reason why is if I go back and I select this, I don't have any physics being applied to this, okay. So it's not going to like move or move around with gravity. So I'm going to, just like we talked about last class, I'm going to add physics, which is going to be a rigid body. Okay. If I go back, that should add physics, which means it should fall with gravity. Now you'll notice it's falling through the floor. The reason why, and this goes back to what we talked about, there's no collider on this. So we're telling it to fall, but it's not collide. You know, the way two objects collide in a game system is they have to tell the program, hey, these two things are knocking into each other. The way that we can do that is we are going to add a collider. In this case, I'm going to use a sphere collider, okay, that goes around the entire player, which is a ball. What that should mean now is my player should fall, hit the ground, and it does. Now I'm going to try to move it, and I can't do that. And that's because I need to add some code, okay? So in my scripts here, I'm going to use this script called player move. We'll talk about scripting later today, but what I'm going to do is click and add it to my character as such. This allows my character to move. So if we play the game, I can move around. And what I'm going to do is hit this cube, and I'm passing through the cube, okay? Why am I passing through the cube? The answer is, well, if you click on the cube does not have a collider on it. So it's kind of like the same issue that my red ball did, my player, in that if both objects don't have a collider, they don't collide. So I'm going to add a collider. I'm going to add a box collider to it. All right. And the result should be now that my object or my player, which is the red ball, should bounce off or collide with the yellow cube. And if I do that, boom, I'm doing that now. Okay. Now that's great. What I want to do though is I don't want to get too deep into the code right now. We'll cover that in a later video today. But what I want to do is to I have this event. Okay. You guys remember events, hopefully from P5 when you guys learned that in 327 and 427. An event is something like a key press or like a mouse press, right? So it's like, you know, when you were writing code, it waited for something to happen, right? So I'm going to do this super quickly. So if I go to P5.js, I can write some code like this function mouse pressed. And what this will do is it waits for the event, which in this case is a mouse press, and then it runs some code. So I'm going to run this. Nothing happens until I press my key on my, my mouse on my keyboard or mouse on my computer. But then when I press it, the code's been launched. Okay. So what this is right here, this is kind of the same thing. The event here is though not a mouse press or a keyboard press. Instead, what it is it's waiting for something to be triggered. Okay. So the way I like to think of it is kind of like a mouse trap. All right. So like I was saying, sorry for the pause there. I was trying to get this slide going. You got to think of a trigger kind of like a mouse trap, where it's like the action is, the thing coming down, but the trigger is this, right? The mouse steps on this and it causes the trap to go, so to speak. So what's happening is I need to trigger this code. Okay, I have some code written that says if I don't want to get too deep into this, and we'll talk a little bit about this later. This is a function, kind of like the function I had here. If I didn't close it or delete it, maybe I did. Oops, maybe I did. Anyway, in my example where I didn't close it. All right. So this is a function, right? And so is this. And the function is basically saying, when this runs, when on trigger enter means when a trigger has been done, what's causing the trigger, something to collide, colliding with what? The other, do the following. Okay, which in this case is you know, causing this to occur. Now, the way I'm going to get this to work, I want that code, this line of code to work. Now, normally it should show up in the console here, but if I were to hit the play button, any day now, oops, there we go. And I do this, it is colliding, but it's not triggering, even though it was supposed to be a trigger code. So what I'm going to do is, the reason why it's not working is if I go to my scene, I need to have what's called a trigger. Okay. What this says is if something collides with the object, it will trigger possibly some code. Okay. Now, the way I'm going to do that is, well, we have this little option here that says is trigger. And I'm going to turn that on. And let's hit play. And what's going to happen is now, when I do this, you can see I'm triggering down here in my console. Now, the other problem is this. You might notice that, oops, well, it's not, the collider is not actually acting like a collider anymore. I'm actually able to like run right through this like it, and that's not what I want either. So the thing about this is like, well, when you make a collider a trigger, it no longer acts as a collider. Okay. I kind of feel like there should be a separate component for this, but unfortunately, at least currently, this is how it works. So what I would say is like, okay, the way we can fix this problem is I'm going to add another box collider. Okay. So there's actually two box colliders, one that's the trigger, one that's the collider. So now one is going to stop the ball from going through it while the other is going to trigger the code. And boom. Okay. So if I try to run through this, that's not going to work. Okay. So that's what a trigger is. Trigger, like it sounds like, causes possibly at least code to occur. Okay. I'm going to go to exercise scene 2 here. And I have a ball, and I've actually already added, it already has the rigid body and the collider, and I have this code being applied to it that allows it to move. Okay. And if I hit play, what's going to happen is it's going to run and it's going to hit that back wall there. Okay. See how it happened there? And I want to write some code that if it hits this, that's like the finish line. I want it to say in the console, you have hit the finish line, right? So I'm going to open up the code real quick, which the one that's being applied here is called player move finish line. And what would happen is if I had something like this, anytime you collided with anything, it would say you reached the finish line. Okay. I'm going to save that. Now, that's actually not what I want because, like, I'm going to show you why that wouldn't necessarily be something that we want. Sorry, I'm waiting for my code to run or to save update here. Oops. Uh-oh, what happened? All right, so the reason why I wouldn't want that to happen is I'm going to add a cube to my scene. Okay, let's just make it real big. And I'm just going to make it like black. Okay. And let's also put let's say that also has a trigger on it. Okay. I'm just going to place it like here. Okay. Now, there's two objects in my scene and they both have triggers on it, right? So if I were to run this, how does my program know which one is the finish line? Because they both have the trigger. And then what would happen is if I run into this, oops, I don't know if I hit the trigger on it or not. Oh, there it is. So it's accidentally not, doing it correct. Okay. Because the problem is it's like the game can't or the game engine can't tell the difference between this and this because they all have triggers on it, right? And all that my code basically says is if you collide with something else and it has a trigger on it, then you run this code. So what I need to do instead is we need to make it a little more precise. And the way that an easy way to do that is we can work with something called a game tag. What a game tag is, a game, sorry about that. Game tag allows you to organize elements in your scene for coding purposes. Okay. So what I'm going to do is if you want to add a game tag, come up here. And actually, normally there will be some already built into the scene. Usually we'll have like respawn and camera and player and stuff like that. If you want to add one, I'm going to go to where it says add tag. And I've already actually added a few. I'm going to hit the plus sign here and I'm going to add one that says, let me delete that. Let me do it again. And I'm going to call this finish line, all lowercase, no spaces. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this and I'm going to set that to that new finish line tag. Okay. And then if I come into here, what's actually happening? Hopefully you guys remember if statements. Remember in programming, if means if whatever evaluates is true, then do the following. Okay. So what this is saying basically is if the object you collide with has a game tag of finish line, then do this. So in other words, the finish line code, you've reached the finish line, will only run if and only if it collides with something that has a game tag of finish line applied to it. So because this one has that trigger, but not the tag, it won't do that. So let's just try that out. If I hit the object here, oops. Oh, oops, I think I didn't turn on the trigger. Yeah, this has to be a trigger. Let's try that one more time. Okay, see how that worked. Now I would actually fly through it. because once again, because this is a trigger, it no longer acts as a collider. So I'm going to add a collider to it. Another thing that's kind of fun is you technically don't even have to have this be visible for the trigger to work. You can turn off what's called the mesh renderer. The mesh renderer is what the mesh is the visual part that the light bounces off of. So if you turn it off, it actually will make it invisible, but the object is still there. So what I'm going to do now, you can see how we no longer see the finish line, right? And then I'm going to go forward like this. And you can see I'm hitting that wall there and it's triggering even though we can't see it. Okay. So game tags are useful. We can use them to our advantage. I would recommend that the reason why you might want to do it is maybe you want to make a game tag for like enemy, and every time your character hits an enemy, something happens. Or every time your character hits a tree, something happens. Or maybe every time your character picks up an apple or whatever it is. Um, you can use game tags to kind of work with that. Okay. Another thing we can do. So I have this scene here, and I already have this, here's my player, and the player has spheres, has a collider on it, it has gravity applied, and it has a script being applied. All of the elements here have colliders on them. Okay. So if I were to play this game or put this into, what should happen is, oops. Oh, oops. Sorry. Give me 1 second. All right, let's try that again. I hadn't set up my file correctly. Yours should be set up correctly though. So what should happen here is you can see that I'm bouncing off all of these objects here, right? Whee! Okay. Let's just say for the sake of argument, I want to have these objects here, but let's just say for the sake of argument, I don't want to have I don't want the sphere to interact with the cubes. Let's just say for some reason I'm allowed to pass through those, but not through other objects. Okay. So, and maybe other objects might interact with the cubes. So I don't want to just make it from everyone, just my player. What I can do, another way to organize this is you can actually work with something called layers. Okay. What you can do is you can organize things into layers, and then you can actually use those layers to tell the program what is allowed to interact with what. Okay. So I'm going to add a layer here. And when I do that, you're going to see I get things like these. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a layer called player. And I'm going to make a layer called squares. And I'm going to make a layer called spikes. Okay. So I've made these layers. I'm going to close this. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the player into the player layer. I'm going to put the cubes into the cube or the square layer. I guess I should have called it cubes, but whatever. And I'm going to put the spikes into the spikes layer. Okay. Now, by default, they are organized. That doesn't really do a lot. You could turn off everything in one layer if you really wanted to do that. There are ways of turning off objects within a layer. But that's not what I really want to do right now. But if I hit play, nothing's going to happen yet. So, give me a second. All right. So see how I don't, um, see how I'm not hitting those objects, but I am hitting those. Now, actually, once again, all right. So you can see that I did put them in layers, but I'm still bumping into things, right? I don't want my player to hit these objects, anything that's in either of the spikes or the squares layer. Okay. So what I can actually do is I'm going to go to the project settings as a whole. Remember, this is where we played around with the gravity. I'm going to go under physics. And under physics, this is where gravity was. There's also this thing here called layer collision matrix. And it might seem a little confusing, but what it's doing is it's basically saying what layers interact with what other layers. Okay. The reason why doing this can help is um, the more that your computer has to think about all the things going on in your world, the slower your world's going to run. If you're if your game doesn't have to worry if two objects are colliding or not, or anything from one layer is going to collide with anything from another layer, it makes the job of the game a little easier, and therefore it's going to run a little faster. So the only thing I'm going to worry about is here is this player. See how player is set to spikes, squares, UI, blah, 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 blah. What this is saying is, does the player or anything on the player layer, which in this case is my red ball, is it going to collide with things on the spike, square, UI, water, um, player, and then default? Okay. I don't want the player to interact with the spike layer, and I don't want it to interact with the squares layer. Okay. It will interact with all of the other layers here. Okay. So that means that it should interact with my orange rings, because although um, the reason why I should collide with them is they're set to the default layer, not to one of these layers. And so far, my player layer should be able to collide with this, and this, and this. Okay. So let's try that again. Now, I'm going to go into game mode here. And what's going to happen is you can see I'm not going to hit any of those objects, but I will bounce off of these because those were in default. Okay. Now, if I decided later on I didn't want my player to interact with these, let's take the rings and put them onto the squares layer. I think both of them got that. No, let's send them both to square. Now, what should happen is my character shouldn't interact with those either, because it doesn't interact with anything on the squares layer. All right, see that? See how I passed right through that? Okay. Last thing I'm going to talk about, let's kind of put everything together. Okay. All right. I have this player, and if I click on this, it already has the, rigid body applied, and it has this script applied. Okay. And I'm going to run the script real quick. And the script essentially, it sets up a variable. Okay. Hopefully you guys remember variables from like P5 and all that. And what it basically says is that if you collide with another object and that object has um, a game tag of ring, turn off the other object. Ring equals ring plus one. So, you have a variable called ring. It was set to 0, then it's going to be 1, then 2, then 3. Okay. And then it's going to say, you have collected a ring. This is going to print to the console. So let's try this. I have this ring right here, and it actually already has a collider applied to it, and it has a trigger. Okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a game tag called ring. Kept doing that. Let's do it again. Plus sign, ring. Okay. And then I'm going to select this and set this to ring. And what should happen is when I run, when my character rolls, it should. make that disappear, and then I get a little message. Now that's one ring, right? Now, what if I wanted to add multiple rings to this? What I could do is I could add another object, add another material, add another box collider, do this, set the, that's a lot of work. Okay. There's another way we can kind of save ourselves a little bit of time, and it's called a prefab. Okay. Prefab is short for prefabrication. And what it means is that you can take any object in Unity and make it kind of like sort of like a finished model, and you can duplicate that object really quickly. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of this object, which is this second ring here. I'm just going to delete it. And what I'm going to do to make this a prefab, I already have a menu called a folder called prefab. You don't have to have this, but I just think it's easier. And what I'm going to do is literally drag it into this folder, this project folder here. Okay. And when I do that, it's going to make a prefab. Okay. You can tell it's a prefab because if you look down here, it says ring.prefab. Okay. This is showing you what that ring has. So it has a yellow material applied to it. It has a box collider. It has a trigger. It has a tag of ring. Okay. And it tells you who's the original parent, which is ring. What I'm going to do is from this prefab, I'm actually just going to add a bunch of rings here. So I'm just like clicking and dragging this in. And then I'm just going to kind of rotate these as such. Maybe I'll put some back here. Okay. So all of these rings I've added to my scene, they're all a prefab. They're all a copy of this one. Okay. And if I click on all of them, you'll notice all of them have the same thing. They have a box collider with a trigger, and they have the tag of ring, box collider, trigger, game tag of ring, box collider, trigger, game tag of ring, so on and so on and so on and so on. Okay. I'm going to go and let's hit play. All right. And boom, 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 boom. Okay. Now, what's nice about prefabs are if you were to ever change a prefab, it would actually edit all of your copies. So for instance, easy way to do this is I'm going to take this prefab and I'm going to edit it. I'm going to double click 1, 2. And when you do that, you kind of get this kind of blue kind of, I call it the netherworld, where it's like it just kind of exists on its own. And I can make any changes I want. And any changes I make are going to affect all of the copies. So for instance, maybe I'm going to change the material from yellow to red. I'm just going to drag the red material and you can see that they're updated. Okay. Maybe I'm going to take this model and, maybe, I don't know if I can edit it from here, but I'm going to use one of the existing ones. So I'm actually going to switch out the mesh for another mesh. Maybe not. Can I use capsule? So I'm using one of the existing meshes here. All right. And then I'm going to get out of this by hitting this little back button. And when I do that, see how everything automatically changed? So it's like I was able to swap out not just the color, but models. I could have added or subtracted code or anything I wanted to do. I could have done that. It's a little confusing now, so maybe I'll make this the yellow item. And I'm going to hit play. And there you go. All right. So hopefully you see why prefabs are helpful. It's really good when you have big, more complicated worlds to use prefabs so that if you need to make changes, you can kind of quickly do that. Okay. In the next video, I'm going to talk about programming. okay, using C sharp.